Moji Rose, and today we're going to be talking about how do humans solve problems and there still be mysteries, considering tautologies and a question from Moji Rose Conversation 77 with Dr. Philippe Niklas. I really enjoyed the conversation with Philippe. He recently got his PhD in philosophy, which is an impressive accomplishment, and he is a Hegel scholar who will soon be teaching a class at the Halcon Guild on the phenomenology of spirit, and I suggest it. I enjoy his work. He's recently put out some videos, one on habit with Hegel, which was magnificent, and that's a topic I'm particularly interested in. And also, Philippe put out a video on why study philosophy that I found magnificent and gave extremely good reasons for studying philosophy. And so it's excellent that Philippe is doing this work. In our conversation, Philippe made a comment on how it's very interesting that human beings can solve problems, and yet no matter how many problems they solve, there's always still mystery. And how that's kind of strange. And is that in of itself a problem, or is it a mystery? This is fairly profound because there's some sense in which some human efforts do see that as a problem. Maybe you can associate that with technological singularity or certain efforts to overcome the human psyche in different ways. I would put those all under the category of what I call alterologies, which is kind of trying to solve the problem of the fact that no matter how many problems humans solve, there's still mystery. Whereas there's another take that we can align with maybe a more philosophical understanding of human beings that says there is something about humans of which essentially requires there to be mystery. And a mystery, I think it's important to understand a mystery is not something that we can't know anything about, but something that the more we know about, the more we find there's more to know. It's more like a path that keeps going than a wall. And it's very interesting that humans, no matter what they learn, still have some sort of mysterious element about it. And fitting this with Hegel, there's a sense in which the development of, if we were to say, consciousness of the subject, as it is trying to obtain understanding of itself, finds that the very ways that it finds understanding always opens up new questions. There's a way of looking at the structure of the phenomenology of spirit. If we take each section, moving from, say, a consciousness into a self-consciousness into a reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing, so on and so forth. Every one of these is constituted by a kind of failure where precisely at the moment where you think you're going to achieve full self-consciousness, you realize that your identity is constituted by an interaction with other self-consciousness, other subjects of which you cannot know fully. And so the belief that one can achieve some sort of final, full understanding in self-consciousness is immediately unveiled to be a failure, in that it must move into reason. But then as you move into reason, where you try to take into account of the other and thus have being for self become one with being for other, it is found out that this would require one to move into the entire realm of spirit, and that would require moving into the entire realm of religion. So there's always a kind of failure that is realized in each stage, right at the moment of completion. Right when you think you're about to once and for all solve the problem of the human condition, new vistas open up that have to be addressed. And Mr. Chad Haig recently put out a summary video of his class on his lectures on the phenomenology of spirit that did, I just thought, a magnificent job of showing how every movement in Hegel is constituted by a failure right at the moment of completion. And is this a problem? Or is the fact that this occurs part of the mystery of what makes human beings human beings? How you answer that is very important. And what's very interesting is the answer to that question doesn't seem like it can be given to you by your immediate experience of the world. We have to decide for ourselves if we think the fact that whenever we think we're about to achieve completion, we don't, if that's a problem, or if it's something essential to what makes human beings human beings. And I would associate that with a non-rational choice, of which then suggests that non-rationality is a part of reality. And what I mean by non-rationality is described in the paper called The Absolute Choice, which will be coming out in the Hegel anthology from Philosophy Portal, headed by Dr. Cadell Last, and that is a collection of pieces from students who were part of his class on the phenomenology of spirit. We also had a wonderful symposium where I had a chance to describe and talk about the absolute choice. But basically, a non-rational choice is a choice that cannot be grounded in rationality. It has to be something radically other than rationality, because there is nothing given in our immediacy that would prove that the fact that we always have new problems to solve in of itself is a problem or a mystery. Deciding which of those schemas that reality of the human condition falls under is something that we have to choose. We're not given evidence by our reality one way or the other, so we have to decide. And then, furthermore, constitute our reality according to that decision. And one could say that part of the business of philosophy is to help us think through decisions or situations that are not given to us or answered by our immediacy, our immediate experience. I mentioned it in the paper, but there's a great book by Walker Percy called Lost in the Cosmos, where he explores this kind of interesting dilemma where it seems like precisely when we've learned the most about the world, when we've gone to the moon, when science is really advanced, that's when we see most need of self-help books. And Lost in the Cosmos is kind of a parody self-help book. And how strange is this? That precisely when scientific knowledge is so great that we seem to know the least about ourselves. Why is that? Why is it that the more we learn about the universe, we seem not to know ourselves less? And this would suggest that there is something about human beings that is not given to us by the immediate and ready at hand experience of the universe. That there is something about humans that is not really readily captured by that. Now, arguably, Philippe will have conversations and work with Johannes, the great Heidegger scholar. And one of the ways I think we can see Heidegger is someone who viewed Western philosophy as operating under a paradigm of problem solving, of solving problems. And that has a very important role. My goodness, science has a very important role. But what Heidegger seems to have understood is that with Nietzsche, philosophy was reaching its end, of which was primarily in the business of problem solving. And philosophy would need to engage in a mode of witnessing mystery, if you will, not trying to solve mystery. Because here's the thing. Following Heidegger, what tends to happen is if we try to solve mystery, then we're solving away the essential mystery that partly constitutes what humans are. And if we solve that away, then we cease to be human. And so Heidegger, a way that I think about his philosophical project is he's in the business of helping us witness suchness or witness being, as opposed to try to capture being or solve being. And Johannes, in one of his presentations on Heidegger, talks about how we need to we're always trying to solve everything, but you don't really solve a cliff. You might climb a cliff, but it's not like it vanishes into thin air. And I always love that example Johannes gives. Likewise, we can't solve away being, and if we try, we're just going to become pathological and enter into effacement, is what I like to say. And so it's very important for us to gain the ability to witness being, to witness suchness, or we might solve ourselves away, and that would also get into the language of explain and address, where we need to make space in our worldviews and ways of engaging in the world that make space for address, not just explanation. Because when we try to explain something, when instead we need to address it and let it address us, then we'll probably just end up explaining it away. And that is a big problem, and I think that's part of the meaning crisis today. The paper will also get into the funny reality of tautologies, which, Dr. Niklas also noted how Hegel seems to see so much fascination in with tautologies. And a tautology is just kind of a X equals Y statement. It's a kind of simplistic statement that doesn't really say anything. And the paper kind of makes a case study of this, because the very fact that human beings would utter a certain tautology would suggest that for some reason a given subject believes that tautology unveils something about itself of which is not given, even though the statement itself seems to solve itself. If I have a statement like, cats are animals, you can kind of go, okay, a cat is an animal. It's kind of simple, right? It's just kind of there. It doesn't really add anything. Everyone knows that. But if I'm saying it must be in a situation where maybe a cat has scratched my daughter or it scratched me, and so I'm saying cats are animals, where suddenly it's a kind of tautology. It's a kind of Y equals X structure. But the very fact that I am uttering it says something about the situation that I am in. And yet, the statement cats are animals is kind of universal, right? I mean, it always applies in all situations and is equally true. And yet the very utterance of it would suggest that there is something situational going on in the moment of which it is uttered that is unveiled by that statement that doesn't seem to say anything new. In a way, the statement solves itself. It completes itself, right? Cats are animals. You're done. That's all you need to know, right? X equals Y. It's sort of over. And so it doesn't add anything. It's a problem that solves itself, but precisely because it's a problem that solves itself, it points to this mysterious element of human beings where we are able to use statements that mean something, that universally mean something, but use them situationally so that that universal is always particularized, which also is quite strange because it would suggest that the universals are never consistently pointing to the same thing, that they're always pointing to same situations, and yet the statement as a universal presents itself as if it is not saying something that is situationally bound, and yet it is necessarily situationally bound, and this is very mysterious. How can human beings use statements that are universal and in the same wording, mind you, in the same structure, and yet have different ways in its particular implementation, different meanings in those different implementations. And again, the very fact that consciousness that a given subject would utter a tautology in a given situation would suggest that the consciousness is trying to say something to itself, perhaps, that it remembers, that somehow this tautology is for consciousness. Consciousness wants to know now and not forget that cats are animals, meaning they are dangerous. And again, a tautology is just kind of is a basic statement that is necessarily true by its own logic, or that is simply repeating the same idea in different ways. It's adding nothing. And so anytime that human beings just say something that has to be true, like if I were to say that speaking involves sound, you would go, yeah, oh, yeah, speaking involves sound, yes. Yes, we know that. Cats are animals, yes, I know that. But it's funny, if I feel a need to say speaking involves sounds, then somehow I'm pointing to the mystery of, isn't it weird that words are made of sounds, and yet sounds usually don't mean anything, or sound waves don't necessarily mean anything in their own right? How in the world are we able to get meaning from sound waves? So again, that's an example where one is speaking a tautology, but it is consciousness trying to unveil something that maybe consciousness takes for granted so that it understands the world in a new way. The subject is going, wait a minute, words are sound waves. And suddenly the mystery strikes you. So in this way, if we were to kind of combine together some Heidegger and Hegel, there's a way in which a tautology, as solving its own problem, necessarily then makes a clearing from which the mystery of consciousness and the human subject arises. Where, Heidegger is always interested in this notion of a clearing that is going to make an opening for suchness of being to strike us. But of course, it's difficult because every clearing also can have a hiding element to it. So it's very difficult to have a clearing that's not just a hiding, but an actual clearing from which being can emerge and truly strike us. In the same way that if you really take seriously the fact that one is uttering a statement that solves itself, this points to the mystery of the human subject. And the fact that problems that solve themselves can still point to something beyond themselves. But how is that possible if A equals A? If things simply are what they are, why do tautologies point to unique situations in their universality? It seems like they shouldn't be able to do that. A is A, a cat is an animal. It shouldn't mean anything more than that. In every single situation it's uttered, it should mean the same thing, and yet it does not. And consciousness, the human subject, seems to have an awareness of this, thus the utterance of the statement so that strikes the subject anew, and precisely because it is a repetition, it's a universal that could be said in different situations, the repetition unveils the negativity because it shows that the repetition must not be truly a repetition because it changes in the situation. There was that piece with Hyrule where we talked about how Hyrule made that example where he said, there are rock climbers and then there are rock climbers. And he's showing how you're repeating the same statement, and yet precisely because you're repeating the same statement, when it's said again, it's utterly clear that you're dealing with a negation that points beyond itself as opposed to new information. If I were to say there are rock climbers, but then there are also really good rock climbers, the statements are slightly different, so it's not clearly a negation as opposed to an introduction of new information. But when it's a repetition and someone can hear it and get a sense of, oh yeah, that's different, then it's clearly a negation, which then points to how A is not A, or it's not A is not A, but in a unstable manner, where it is having to refer to itself, and then, to use Mr. Ebert's language, it's collapsing in that referral, but then instantly reconstituted by the need to have something stable so that the world has meaning. And you see all of this kind of being pointed to in the tautology, precisely because the tautology doesn't seem like it says anything. And this is why it seems like Hegel's so interested in this, is precisely in these things that don't seem like they say anything, that they say a whole lot, that you can hear a lot in silence, that when you have a problem that solves itself in its very presentation, and yet things are not finished, and yet there's still something more going on, this would suggest that there's something about human beings that is fundamentally mysterious, which I think the exploration of which will ultimately take us to the place of absolute knowing, as I talked about with Dr. Cadell last. And at that point of absolute knowing, we find that the mystery of the human subject comes out precisely in the fact that it is perpetually reconstituting the meaning of that mystery and itself in the realization of that mystery. And that thus the mystery entails an evermore to itself, of which makes it everlasting, but then also worth pursuing. Because how terrible would it be if the universe was composed of problems that we could solve, and once they were solved, they went away? For more, by Dr. Philippe Niklas, I suggest highly his YouTube channel. He does also work with the European Hegel Society, and he has wonderful conversations with Johannes over at Johannes's channel. And for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com. And thank you so much for your time.